He divorced his wife right after she delivered triplets, before she could even touch her babies. He flung the divorce papers onto her hospital bed, the sharp corner scraping her trembling fingers as he barked, "Sign it now. I'm done with you, and don't you dare come near me with the babies again." Her whole body shook as tears splashed onto the papers and she whispered, "Please, we can talk after, please." But he only stepped back with disgust. His mother stood beside him, arms folded, smiling like she had waited her entire life for this moment, before saying coldly, "You got what you deserved. I'm glad my son finally listened. He's moving on with his mistress. You'll survive." In that instant, something inside her shattered, quietly but completely. Her heart broke, and in that break, something dangerous awakened, something that would destroy them all. But before we begin, if you believe women deserve love, protection, and respect, don't watch silently. Make sure to subscribe. It's a simple way for women to stand with other women. And please drop a comment telling us the exact time and place you're watching from. It means more than you know. Now let's go back to where it all started. The bathroom floor was cold against Evelyn's knees as she stared at the pregnancy test in her trembling hands. One line. Always one line. She dropped it into the wastebasket, where 17 others had landed this year alone, each one a silent scream her body refused to hear. Her fingers pressed against her empty stomach, and the sob that escaped her throat was so quiet it didn't even echo in the marble bathroom of the Lancaster mansion. 5 years of this. 5 years of hope dying slower than anything should be allowed to die. She heard the dinner bell chime downstairs, 3 sharp rings that meant Margaret Lancaster was waiting, and Margaret Lancaster did not tolerate lateness. Evelyn wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, stood on shaking legs, and checked her reflection in the mirror. Red eyes, pale face, the look of a woman drowning in a house full of people who would watch her sink. She pinched her cheeks to bring back color, forced her lips into something that could pass for a smile, and walked downstairs into the dining room where the family was already seated. Margaret sat at the head of the table like a queen on a throne, her silver hair pulled back so tight it looked painful, her diamond necklace catching the chandelier light and throwing little rainbows across the white tablecloth. Garrett's father, Richard, was reading something on his phone, barely looking up when Evelyn entered. Vivian, Garrett's younger sister, was filing her nails with a smirk already forming on her glossy lips. And Garrett, her husband, the man who once promised to protect her from the world, sat stiff and distant, his jaw clenched like he was preparing for battle. He didn't look at her when she sat down. He hadn't really looked at her in months. "You're late," Margaret said, her voice smooth as silk and just as cold. "We've been waiting." Evelyn opened her mouth to apologize, but Margaret raised one perfectly manicured hand. "No excuses, darling. Punctuality is respect, and respect is something you seem to struggle with." Vivian snickered into her wine glass. Richard didn't even glance up. Garrett said nothing, just reached for his water and drank like the conversation wasn't happening. The first course arrived, a delicate soup Evelyn couldn't name and didn't want. Her stomach was still twisted from the negative test, from the crushing weight of another month gone. Another failure added to the list her body seemed determined to write. She picked up her spoon, but her hands were shaking so badly the silver clattered against the bowl. Margaret's eyes snapped to the sound like a hawk spotting a wounded rabbit. "Nervous, Evelyn?" Margaret asked, her smile sharp enough to draw blood. "Or just unwell again? You've been looking rather peaked lately. Pale. Tired. One might think you're not taking care of yourself." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Evelyn knew what was coming. It always came. "I'm fine, Margaret," Evelyn said quietly, keeping her eyes on her soup. "Just a long day." Margaret leaned back in her chair, swirling her wine in slow, deliberate circles. "A long day doing what exactly? You don't work. You don't have children to care for. You barely leave the house unless it's for some charity event where you stand in the corner looking lost." Vivian laughed, a high, cruel sound that made Evelyn's skin crawl. "Mother, stop. You're going to make her cry again." Margaret's smile widened. "Oh, darling, I'm simply stating facts. Facts aren't cruel. They're just true." Evelyn's throat tightened, but she forced herself to swallow a spoonful of soup even though it tasted like ash. Across the table, Garrett finally looked at her, and for a split second, she thought she saw something, pity, maybe, or regret. But then his expression hardened, and he looked away. That look, or lack of it, hurt more than anything Margaret could say. Because Margaret was supposed to hate her. Margaret had made that clear from day one. But Garrett? Garrett was supposed to love her. That's what he'd promised when he slid the ring on her finger 5 years ago in a ceremony that cost more than most people's homes. He'd whispered, "I'll always protect you." And she'd believed him. God, how she'd believed him. Any news to share? Margaret asked suddenly, her voice innocent, but her eyes glittering with malice. Good news, perhaps? Something we've all been waiting for. The table went silent. Even Richard put down his phone. Vivian stopped filing her nails and leaned forward, her smile growing wider. Garrett's jaw clenched tighter, a muscle jumping in his cheek. Evelyn felt every pair of eyes on her, felt the weight of their expectations crushing down on her chest until she could barely breathe. "No," she whispered, the words scraping out of her throat like gravel. "No news." Margaret sighed dramatically, placing her wine glass down with a soft clink that sounded like a judge's gavel. 5 years, Evelyn. 5 years of waiting. 5 years of hoping you'd fulfill the one duty expected of you. And still nothing. Tell me, have you seen the specialists I recommended? Have you tried the treatments? Or are you simply incapable? The last word landed like a slap. Incapable. Broken. Useless. That's what they thought of her. That's what they'd always thought. She's barren, Vivian said cheerfully, as if she were commenting on the weather. Admit it, Evelyn. Your body just doesn't work. Some women are built for this, and some aren't. You're just not. Evelyn's vision blurred with tears, and she refused to let fall. Not here. Not in front of them. She dug her nails into her palms under the table, using the pain to anchor herself, to keep from breaking apart right there at the dinner table. That's enough, Garrett said, but his voice was weak, half-hearted, like he was reading lines from a script he didn't believe in. Margaret waved him off. Oh, don't defend her, darling. She needs to hear the truth. Coddling her won't make her fertile. She turned back to Evelyn, her eyes cold and sharp as diamonds. You married into one of the most powerful families in this country, and you've brought us nothing. No connections. No class. No children. You're decorative at best, Evelyn, and even that's fading. Look at you. You're wasting away. And for what? Clinging to some fantasy that you'll wake up one day and suddenly be useful. Richard finally spoke, his voice deep and dismissive. Margaret's right. This is embarrassing. My colleagues ask about grandchildren. What am I supposed to tell them? That my son's wife is defective. He said the word like she was a broken appliance that should have been returned for a refund. Evelyn's chest felt like it was caving in, like her ribs were collapsing under the weight of their words. She looked at Garrett, silently begging him to say something, to do something, to be the man he'd promised to be. But Garrett just stared at his plate, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he'd never say. You're a disappointment, Margaret said simply, her voice almost kind now, which made it so much worse. And disappointments don't last long in this family. She stood up, smoothing her dress with elegant hands. I've lost my appetite. Vivian, Richard, let's leave them alone. Perhaps Garrett can talk some sense into her. She walked out, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown. Vivian followed, pausing only to lean down and whisper in Evelyn's ear, "Tick-tock, sister-in-law. Tick-tock." Then she was gone, her laughter echoing down the hallway. Richard didn't say another word, just stood and left, leaving Evelyn and Garrett alone in the cavernous dining room. The silence stretched between them like an ocean. Evelyn's hands were still shaking, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps she couldn't control. She waited for Garrett to reach for her, to say something comforting, to remind her that they were in this together. Instead, he pushed his chair back and stood, his face unreadable. Maybe they're right, he said quietly, his eyes finally meeting hers. Maybe you're just not capable. The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Garrett ran a hand through his hair, looking tired and frustrated and nothing like the man she'd married. I can't keep defending you when there's nothing to defend. 5 years, Evelyn. 5 years, and you can't give me one child. What am I supposed to do with that? He didn't wait for an answer. He just walked out, leaving her sitting alone at the table with cold soup and colder words echoing in her head. Evelyn sat there for a long time, staring at the empty chairs, at the untouched food, at the life she'd thought she'd have dissolved like sugar in rain. Finally, she stood on numb legs and walked upstairs to the guest bedroom they'd turned into a nursery. Soft yellow walls, a white crib in the corner, a rocking chair by the window. She sat in that chair and rocked slowly, her arms wrapped around herself, pretending she was holding the baby she didn't have. I'll love you, she whispered to the empty room. I'll protect you. I'll make sure nobody ever makes you feel like this. Her voice cracked, and the tears finally came, hot and silent and endless. She cried until there was nothing left inside her, but a hollow ache and a tiny, stubborn spark of hope that refused to die, no matter how hard they tried to kill it. Because Evelyn Hayes had learned something in 5 years of cruelty, 5 years of humiliation, 5 years of being told she was worthless. She'd learned how to survive. And surviving was the first step to something far more dangerous. It was the first step to fighting back. 3 weeks after that dinner, Evelyn woke up at dawn and vomited violently into the toilet. Her whole body shook as she emptied her stomach, sweat beading on her forehead, her hands gripping the cold porcelain like it was the only solid thing in a world that wouldn't stop spinning. When the nausea finally passed, she sat back against the bathroom wall, breathing hard, her heart hammering in her chest. Morning sickness. The thought hit her like lightning, and for the first time in 5 years, she felt something that terrified her more than hope ever had. She felt possibility. Her hands trembled as she opened the cabinet under the sink and pulled out a pregnancy test from the box she'd hidden behind the cleaning supplies. She'd stopped keeping them in plain sight months ago because seeing them was like staring at her own failures. But now, with her stomach still churning and her body feeling strange and foreign, she unwrapped the test with shaking fingers and did what she'd done 100 times before. Then she waited. Those 3 minutes felt longer than the entire 5 years combined. She paced the bathroom, her bare feet silent on the tile, her breath coming in short gasps. Please, she thought. Please let this be real. Please let this be the moment everything changes. When she finally looked down at the test, there were 2 lines. 2 perfect, undeniable lines. Evelyn's legs gave out, and she sank to the floor, clutching the test to her chest like it was made of glass. A sob burst from her throat, not the quiet, broken sobs she'd cried 1,000 times before, but a raw, gasping sound of pure relief. She was pregnant. After 5 years of trying, of failing, of being told her body was broken and useless, she was finally pregnant. She pressed her hand to her stomach, which still felt flat and unchanged, and whispered, "You're real. You're real, and I'm going to love you more than anything in this world." But even in that moment of joy, fear crept in like a shadow. What would Margaret say? What would Garrett do? Would they even believe her, or would they accuse her of lying, of faking, of being desperate enough to invent a pregnancy just to save herself? The thought made her stomach turn again, but this time it wasn't morning sickness. It was dread. Still, she had proof now. She had this test, and soon she'd have a doctor's confirmation, and then they'd have to believe her. They'd have to see that she wasn't broken, that she'd finally given them what they demanded. She let herself hope, just for a moment, that maybe this would change everything. Maybe they'd finally accept her. Maybe Garrett would look at her the way he used to. Maybe the cruelty would stop. She was wrong. That evening, the family gathered in the sitting room for their usual after-dinner ritual. Margaret holding court from her velvet armchair, Richard reading his newspaper, Vivian scrolling through her phone with a bored expression, and Garrett nursing a glass of whiskey by the window. Evelyn stood in the doorway, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white, the positive pregnancy test folded in her pocket like a secret weapon. Her heart pounded, so hard she thought everyone could hear it. "I have something to tell you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret looked up from her magazine, one perfectly shaped eyebrow raised. "Oh, do share, Evelyn. We could use some entertainment." Vivian snorted, not even bothering to look up from her phone. Garrett turned from the window, his expression already guarded, like he was bracing himself for disappointment. Evelyn took a deep breath and forced the words out. "I'm pregnant." The room went dead silent. Margaret's magazine slipped from her fingers and landed on the floor with a soft thud. Richard's newspaper crinkled as he lowered it slowly, his eyes narrowing. Vivian's head snapped up, her mouth falling open in genuine shock. And Garrett just stared at her, his face completely blank, like she'd spoken in a language he didn't understand. "What did you say?" Margaret asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Evelyn's hands shook, but she pulled the pregnancy test from her pocket and held it up like evidence in a trial. "I'm pregnant. I took the test this morning. It's positive." She waited for smiles, for congratulations, for some small acknowledgement that this was good news. Instead, Margaret's eyes went cold as ice. She stood slowly, her movements precise and controlled, and walked across the room until she was standing directly in front of Evelyn. Then she plucked the test from Evelyn's hand, examined it with a kind of scrutiny usually reserved for forgeries, and handed it back with a look of pure disgust. "One test means nothing," Margaret said flatly. "You'll see a doctor. You'll get blood work. And if this turns out to be real, don't expect us to throw you a parade. You've done what any woman with functioning organs should be able to do. It's not an achievement, Evelyn. It's basic biology." She turned and walked back to her chair, picking up her magazine as if the conversation was already over. Vivian let out a laugh that sounded more like a bark. "Oh my God, you're serious? After 5 years, now you're suddenly pregnant? That's convenient timing, don't you think? Almost like you're desperate to stay relevant." Evelyn's face burned. "I'm not lying. I'm pregnant." "We'll see," Richard muttered from behind his newspaper. Wouldn't be the first time a woman faked a pregnancy to trap a man. The accusation hung in the air like poison. Evelyn looked at Garrett, silently begging him to defend her, to say something, to show even the smallest sign that he believed her or cared. But Garrett just downed the rest of his whiskey in one gulp and set the glass on the windowsill with a sharp clink. "Get the blood test," he said coldly. "Then we'll talk." He walked out of the room without another word, leaving Evelyn standing there with her proof crumpled in her hand and her heart sinking into her stomach. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. This was supposed to be the moment everything changed. But nothing had changed. They still looked at her like she was a liar, a burden, a problem they couldn't get rid of fast enough. The next morning, Evelyn went to the doctor alone. She sat in the sterile white room with paper crinkling under her legs, waiting for the blood test results that would confirm what she already knew in her bones. When the doctor came back with a smile and said, "Congratulations, Mrs. Lancaster. You're definitely pregnant," Evelyn burst into tears. The doctor handed her tissues and patted her shoulder awkwardly, probably assuming these were tears of joy. They were partly. But they were also tears of relief, fear, and the crushing weight of knowing that even with proof, her battle was far from over. She brought the official results home and placed them on the dining room table during dinner. Margaret picked them up, read them slowly, and then set them down without a word. "Well," she finally said, her voice clipped, "I suppose you've managed to do something right for once. Though carrying a child and raising one properly are two entirely different things. Let's hope you're more capable of the latter." Vivian rolled her eyes. "Great. Now we have to deal with a crying baby and an incompetent mother. This should be fun." Richard didn't even look up from his plate. And Garrett just nodded once, as if Evelyn had completed a task on a checklist, and went back to eating. No congratulations. No excitement. No joy. Just cold, clinical acknowledgement that she'd finally done what they demanded. As the weeks passed and Evelyn's body began to change, the cruelty didn't stop, it evolved. Margaret criticized everything. "You're eating too much. You'll get fat and never lose weight. You're not eating enough. Are you trying to starve my grandchild? Your posture is terrible. Pregnancy is no excuse to let yourself go. Every comment was a needle, small but sharp, designed to pierce just deep enough to hurt without leaving visible scars. Vivian made jokes about Evelyn's growing belly, calling her the whale, when she thought Evelyn couldn't hear. Richard ignored her completely, as if pregnancy had made her even more invisible than before. And Garrett grew more distant with each passing day. He started coming home later, his explanations vague and his eyes avoiding hers. He stopped touching her entirely, as if her pregnant body disgusted him. When she tried to talk to him about baby names or nursery colors, he'd cut her off with a tired sigh. "Not now, Evelyn. I have more important things to deal with." But Evelyn had something they couldn't touch. She had life growing inside her. At night, when the house was quiet and the cruelty finally paused, she'd lie in bed with her hands on her stomach and whisper to the tiny heartbeat she couldn't yet feel but knew was there. "I'll protect you," she'd promise. "I'll love you enough for both of us. I'll make sure you never feel what I feel. You'll be safe. You'll be loved. I swear it." Those whispered promises became her anchor, her reason to survive each day of humiliation and neglect. She didn't know yet that she wasn't carrying one child. She was carrying 3. She didn't know that the moment she'd been praying for would also be the moment that destroyed everything she tried so hard to hold on to. She didn't know that pregnancy, the thing that was supposed to save her, would become the weapon they'd use to finally cast her aside. But she'd find out soon enough. And when she did, the woman who'd survived 5 years of cruelty would discover that she was capable of something far more powerful than patience. She was capable of vengeance. By her 5th month, Evelyn's belly had grown round and unmistakable, and with it came a cruelty so relentless it felt like drowning in slow motion. Margaret's inspections became daily rituals of humiliation. Every morning at breakfast, she'd circle Evelyn like a predator examining wounded prey, her sharp eyes cataloging every flaw with surgical precision. "You're gaining too much weight," she'd say, her voice dripping with disgust, as she plucked a piece of toast from Evelyn's plate. "Pregnancy is no excuse to let yourself become a cow. My daughter-in-law will not waddle through society like some common peasant." Evelyn would sit there, her hands folded in her lap, her appetite gone, watching Margaret hand the toast to the maid like it was contaminated. How much cruelty can one person absorb before they break completely? Evelyn was learning that the answer was more than she ever thought possible. The clothes Margaret forced her to wear were too tight, designed to showcase her growing body as something shameful rather than beautiful. At charity galas and family dinners, Evelyn felt every stare, every whispered comment, every pitying glance from women who thought they were being kind, but were really just highlighting how far she'd fallen. Vivian made sure of that. At a fundraiser for the Children's Hospital, Vivian stood beside Evelyn in the reception line, smiling for photographs while whispering poison in her ear. "You look like a beached whale in that dress," she hissed through her perfect smile. Everyone staring. They're probably wondering how Garrett could possibly touch something so grotesque. The camera flashed, capturing what looked like 2 sisters-in-law sharing a happy moment. Only Evelyn knew the truth. Only Evelyn felt the words like knives sliding between her ribs. Garrett barely came home anymore. When he did, he reeked of expensive perfume that definitely wasn't Evelyn's, and his shirts were wrinkled in ways that told stories he never bothered to hide. Evelyn would lie awake at night, listening to him stumble into the guest room down the hall, and she'd press her hands to her belly, feeling the baby's kick, wondering if they could sense their father's absence. One night, she couldn't take it anymore. She got out of bed, her pregnant body moving slowly, and knocked on the guest room door. "Garrett," she called softly. "Can we talk?" There was a long pause, then the sound of bed springs creaking and footsteps approaching. The door opened just enough for her to see his face, tired, annoyed, and completely devoid of warmth. "What do you want, Evelyn?" "It's late." His words were slightly slurred, and she could smell whiskey on his breath. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly feeling exposed in her thin nightgown. I wanted to talk about the babies. The doctor said there might be more than one. Twins, maybe. I thought you'd want to know." Garrett's jaw clenched, and he rubbed his face with both hands like she was a problem he was too tired to solve. Twins. Great. Just what we need, more complications. The word hit her like a slap. Complications. That's what their children were to him. Not miracles. Not blessings. Complications. Garrett, please, she whispered, her voice breaking. I know things have been hard, but we're about to be parents. Doesn't that mean anything to you? He looked at her then, really looked at her, and what she saw in his eyes was worse than anger. It was indifference. You want to know what it means to me, he said quietly, his voice cold and measured. It means I'm trapped. It means every time I look at you, I see a mistake I can't undo. It means I wake up every morning wishing I'd married someone else. Someone who didn't need 5 years to do what any normal woman could do in 5 months. Each word was a nail in a coffin she didn't know she was building. Evelyn's hands instinctively moved to protect her belly, as if she could shield the babies from hearing what their father really thought of them. You don't mean that, she said, but her voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. Garrett laughed, a short, bitter sound that held no humor. Don't I? Look at yourself, Evelyn. You're pathetic, needy, desperate. And now you're going to trap me with children I never wanted in the first place. The confession hung in the air between them like poison gas. He never wanted them. All this time, all the trying, all the hoping. He never wanted any of it. Evelyn felt something inside her crack, but it wasn't her heart. Her heart had broken so many times it was more scar tissue than anything else. This was something deeper, something fundamental. This was the moment she realized she was completely, utterly alone. Get out of my sight, Garrett said, already turning back to his room. And don't knock on my door again. I don't want to see you unless it's absolutely necessary. He closed the door in her face, and Evelyn stood there in the dark hallway, one hand on her belly and the other covering her mouth to muffle the sob that threatened to escape. She walked back to her room on numb legs, climbed into the bed that had once been theirs but was now only hers, and cried silently into her pillow until exhaustion finally pulled her under. The next morning, Margaret found her in the library, trying to read a book on childbirth preparation. Put that down, Margaret commanded, snatching the book from Evelyn's hands. You don't need to read about it. Women have been doing this for thousands of years. Your body will know what to do, assuming it's capable of anything. She tossed the book aside and sat down across from Evelyn, her posture perfect and her expression glacial. We need to discuss your future here. Evelyn's heart sank. Nothing good ever came from conversations that started like that. Once you deliver, things will change, Margaret continued, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from her skirt. You'll have a nanny, of course. I won't have you ruining those children with your inadequate parenting. And you'll need to lose the weight immediately. I've already scheduled appointments with a trainer and a nutritionist. We can't have you looking like this permanently. It reflects poorly on the family. She said it all so matter-of-factly, as if she were discussing the weather rather than dismantling Evelyn's entire future as a mother. The children will be Lancasters, Evelyn. That means they'll be raised properly, with discipline and standards. Your input will be minimal at best. Evelyn's hands gripped the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. They were planning to take her children. Not physically, maybe, but in every way that mattered. They'd raise them to despise her, to see her as weak and useless, to become little versions of the monsters who'd tormented her for years. They're my children, Evelyn said quietly, the first spark of defiance she'd shown in months. Margaret's eyes narrowed to slits. They're Lancaster heirs. You're just the vessel that carried them. Don't mistake biology for ownership. She stood, brushing invisible dust from her designer suit. And another thing, I've noticed you've been isolating yourself. No more hiding in your room or skipping social events. You'll attend the Lancaster Foundation Gala next week, and you'll smile and nod and show the world that this family is united. Is that understood? It wasn't a question. It was a command. Evelyn nodded mechanically, too drained to fight. Good, Margaret said with a satisfied smile. Try to wear something that doesn't make you look quite so unfortunate. She walked out, leaving Evelyn sitting alone in the library with the discarded parenting book lying on the floor like a broken promise. The isolation became suffocating. Evelyn had no friends. Margaret had made sure of that years ago by quietly spreading rumors that kept other women at arm's length. She had no family. Her parents had passed away before she met Garrett, and she had no siblings. The staff pitied her, she could see it in their eyes, but pity wasn't friendship, and it certainly wasn't support. She was alone in a house full of people, pregnant with children whose father wished they'd never been conceived, surrounded by a family that viewed her as nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle to their perfect image. The only moments of peace came late at night when she'd sit in the empty nursery and whisper to the life growing inside her. "I know you can hear me," she'd say, her hands moving in slow circles over her belly. "I know you feel what I feel, but I promise you this, I will find a way to protect you. I will find a way to get us out of here. And someday, when you're old enough to understand, I'll tell you that you saved me. Because you did. You gave me a reason to keep breathing when I had nothing else left." At her next doctor's appointment, the truth came out. "Mrs. Lancaster," the doctor said with a warm smile, "I have some surprising news. You're not carrying twins." Evelyn's heart stopped. Was something wrong? Was she losing them? "You're carrying triplets. 3 healthy babies." The words echoed in the examination room like thunder. 3. 3 lives depending on her. 3 reasons to survive. 3 children who would need her to be stronger than she'd ever been. Evelyn's hand flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. The doctor mistook them for joy. They were partly that. But they were also tears of fear, because she knew exactly what this news would mean when she brought it home to the Lancasters. More scrutiny. More cruelty. More reasons for them to doubt her, control her, and ultimately destroy her. She was right. When she told them that evening at dinner, Margaret's face went pale. "Triplets," she repeated, her voice sharp with barely concealed horror. "Are you sure? That's excessive." Vivian burst out laughing. "Oh my God, this is perfect. 3 crying babies, 3 times the humiliation. How are you possibly going to handle that? You can barely handle yourself." Richard shook his head slowly, his expression grim. "This changes things. 3 children at once. It's dangerous. Expensive. Complicated." And Garrett stood up so fast his chair fell backward with a crash. He didn't say a word. He just walked out of the room, and Evelyn heard the front door slam moments later. He didn't come home that night, or the next, or the one after that. And in his absence, Evelyn sat alone in the nursery, surrounded by 3 tiny cribs that had been delivered that afternoon, and she made a promise to the 3 hearts beating inside her. "I will love you enough for both parents. I will fight for you. And one day, I will make them all pay for every moment of this." The contractions started at 3 in the morning, ripping through Evelyn's body like lightning tearing through a storm. She woke up gasping, her hands clutching her swollen belly, sweat already soaking through her nightgown. The pain was unlike anything she'd ever imagined, sharp, relentless, and spreading through her entire body in waves that left her breathless. She reached for the phone on her nightstand with trembling fingers and dialed Garrett's number. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Then voicemail. She tried again. Voicemail. Again. Voicemail. He wasn't answering. Of course he wasn't answering. Why would he answer when she needed him most? The contractions came faster, each one stronger than the last, and Evelyn knew with terrifying certainty that she couldn't wait any longer. She dragged herself out of bed, her legs shaking so badly she had to grip the furniture to stay upright, and made her way down the hallway to Margaret's bedroom. She knocked, softly at first, then harder when there was no response. "Margaret," she called out, her voice weak and strained. "Margaret, I need help. The babies are coming." The door opened, and Margaret stood there in a silk robe, her face cold and unmoved, looking at Evelyn like she was an inconvenience rather than a woman in labor. "It's 3 in the morning," Margaret said flatly. "Surely you can wait until a decent hour." Evelyn doubled over as another contraction hit, a cry escaping her lips before she could stop it. Please, she gasped. I need to get to the hospital. Now. Margaret sighed, the kind of sigh someone makes when asked to do something tedious and beneath them. Fine. I'll call the driver. But don't expect me to hold your hand through this. You wanted children. Now deal with the consequences. She closed the door in Evelyn's face, leaving her standing in the dark hallway, alone and terrified, wondering how someone could be so heartless to a woman about to give birth to her own grandchildren. The ride to the hospital was a blur of pain and fear. Evelyn sat in the back of the car, her hands gripping the leather seat so tightly her knuckles turned white, breathing through contractions that felt like her body was being torn apart from the inside. Margaret sat beside her, silent and stone-faced, scrolling through her phone as if nothing extraordinary was happening. When they arrived at the hospital, the staff rushed out with a wheelchair, their faces full of concern and urgency, emotions that should have been on her family's faces but weren't. Evelyn was taken to a delivery room, hooked up to monitors, surrounded by strangers who spoke in calm, professional tones while her world collapsed around her. She kept asking for Garrett. Where's my husband? Someone please call my husband. But her phone showed nothing but unanswered calls and unread messages. He wasn't coming. Even now, even for this, he wasn't coming. The labor lasted 18 hours. 18 hours of agony, so complete that Evelyn lost all sense of time, all sense of self. There were moments when she thought she might die, when the pain was so overwhelming that death seemed like mercy. The doctors and nurses moved around her with practiced efficiency, their voices fading in and out like radio static. Push, Mrs. Lancaster. You're doing great. Just a little more. But she didn't feel great. She felt like she was being ripped in half, like her body was paying the price for 5 years of suffering in one endless, brutal moment. And through it all, she was alone. No husband holding her hand. No family waiting anxiously outside. Just her, the babies, and the medical staff who were paid to care. Then, finally, a cry. Small and fierce and absolutely perfect. It's a girl, the doctor announced, holding up a tiny, squirming baby covered in blood and vernix. Evelyn's heart exploded with a love so intense it hurt more than the contractions. Her daughter. She'd brought her daughter into the world. Seconds later, another cry, sharper, angrier. Another girl, the nurse said with a smile, placing the second baby on Evelyn's chest for just a moment before whisking her away to be cleaned. And then, after what felt like an eternity, a third cry, quieter, more tentative. And a boy. Congratulations, Mrs. Lancaster. You have triplets, 2 girls and a boy. Evelyn's vision blurred with tears as she heard their voices, their beautiful, perfect voices that meant they were alive and here and hers. For one brief, shining moment, every ounce of pain was worth it. Every cruel word, every lonely night, every moment of suffering. It all meant something because it had led to this. To them. But that moment shattered like glass when the delivery room door burst open. Evelyn's head turned weakly toward the sound, her body exhausted and trembling, her mind still foggy from the trauma of birth. Garrett walked in first, his suit perfectly pressed, his face completely devoid of emotion. Behind him came Margaret, her expression cold and triumphant. Then Vivian, smirking like she was about to watch her favorite movie scene. And finally Richard, looking bored and impatient, checking his watch like he had somewhere better to be. The medical staff stepped back instinctively, sensing that whatever was about to happen, they didn't want to be part of it. Garrett approached the bed where Evelyn lay bleeding and exhausted, her body still trembling from labor, and pulled a crisp manila envelope from his jacket pocket. Have you ever seen someone's world end in real time? Because that's what happened next. Evelyn, Garrett said, his voice flat and businesslike, these are divorce papers. Sign them. The words didn't make sense at first. Divorce papers. Here. Now. While she was still bleeding from bringing his children into the world. She must have heard wrong. She had to have heard wrong. What? She whispered, her voice so we could barely carry it across the small space between them. Margaret stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the hospital floor. You heard him correctly. You've served your purpose. You've given us heirs. But that doesn't mean we have to keep you around. She said it so casually, like she was discussing the weather, like she wasn't destroying a woman who just endured 18 hours of labor to bring her grandchildren into the world. Vivian laughed, that high, cruel laugh Evelyn had come to dread. Oh my God, look at her face. She actually thought this was going to be a happy ending. How pathetic. Evelyn tried to sit up, but her body wouldn't cooperate. Pain shot through her abdomen, and she collapsed back against the pillows, her mind racing to make sense of what was happening. Garrett, please, she begged, her voice cracking. We just had children together. 3 children. Our children. You can't do this. Not now. Not like this. But Garrett's expression didn't change. He stood there looking at her, like she was a stranger, like the last 5 years meant nothing, like the babies crying in the nursery next door weren't his responsibility. I can and I am. I should have done this years ago, but my mother convinced me to wait until you'd given us heirs. Now you have. Now you're done. The cruelty of it was so complete, so calculated, that Evelyn felt something inside her die, not her love for her children, that would never die, but her last shred of hope that the man she'd married still existed somewhere beneath the monster he'd become. Margaret reached down and grabbed Evelyn's left hand, the one that still bore her wedding ring, a symbol of promises that had been lies from the very beginning. This no longer belongs to you, Margaret said coldly, and before Evelyn could react, she yanked the ring off Evelyn's finger with such force it left a red mark on her skin. The ring came off easily. Evelyn had lost so much weight during the pregnancy that it was loose anyway, and Margaret held it up to the light like a trophy. Lancaster property stays with Lancasters. Tears streamed down Evelyn's face, hot and endless. You can't take my children, she said, her voice stronger now despite the tears. They're mine. I carried them. I gave birth to them. You can't take them from me. Richard spoke for the first time, his voice cold and authoritative. Actually, we can. You'll find that the prenuptial agreement you signed gives us full custody in the event of a divorce. You were too naive to read the fine print 5 years ago, and now you'll pay for that stupidity. The words hit her like bullets. The prenup. She'd signed it without reading it carefully, too in love and too trusting to imagine it would ever matter. And now it was the weapon they'd use to take everything from her. Sign the papers, Evelyn, Garrett said, dropping the envelope on her lap. Make this easy on yourself. She looked down at the envelope, then back up at the family that had destroyed her. Every face was cold, unmoved, victorious. They'd planned this. They'd always planned this. From the moment she told them she was pregnant, maybe even before that, they'd been orchestrating this exact moment. They'd kept her isolated, broken her spirit, made sure she had no one to turn to, and now they were discarding her like garbage the second she'd serve her purpose. And the worst part? There was nothing she could do about it. She was weak, alone, penniless, and broken. Or so they thought. Where will I go? She asked quietly, the question hanging in the air like smoke. Margaret shrugged. That's not our concern. You have family, don't you? Oh wait, that's right. You don't. Well, I suppose you'll figure something out. You're resourceful enough to trap a wealthy man. Surely you can find a homeless shelter. Vivian giggled. Richard checked his watch again. And Garrett just stood there, waiting for her signature like he was waiting for a business contract to be finalized. Evelyn's hands shook as she picked up the pen they'd left on top of the papers. She could barely see through her tears, but she forced herself to read the document. Divorce. 0 alimony. 0 assets. 0 custody. They were taking everything, her marriage, her home, her children, her entire life, and leaving her with nothing. But as she signed her name on the dotted line, something shifted inside her. The grief, the humiliation, the crushing pain, it all crystallized into something cold and hard and unbreakable. They thought they'd won. They thought they'd destroyed her completely. They had no idea that in this moment of absolute devastation, they'd created something far more dangerous than a broken woman. They'd created an enemy. Evelyn handed the signed papers back to Garrett, her hand steady now, her tears drying on her cheeks. She looked him directly in the eyes, and for the first time in 5 years, she didn't look away first. You're going to regret this, she said quietly, her voice calm and certain. Garrett laughed. I doubt that. Margaret took his arm, already turning toward the door. Come along. We have arrangements to make for the children. Real arrangements with real parents. They walked out, all four of them, leaving Evelyn alone in the hospital room that still smelled like blood and broken dreams. The door closed with a soft click that sounded like the end of everything. Evelyn lay there, her body broken, her spirit shattered, staring at the ceiling and listening to the distant cries of her children. Children she'd given everything for, children who would now be raised by monsters, children she might never hold again. And in that moment, in that absolute lowest point of her entire existence, something inside her began to burn. Not hope. Something far more powerful. Rage. 2 days after the worst moment of her life, Evelyn sat alone in a sterile hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and broken dreams. Her body still ached from labor. Her breasts hurt from milk that had nowhere to go because her babies had been taken from her before she could even feed them. And her heart felt like it had been carved out of her chest and thrown away. The nurses gave her pitying looks when they came to check her vitals, their sympathy doing nothing to fill the void where her children should have been. She'd asked about them 17 times in the past 48 hours, asked to see them, hold them, feed them, anything. Each time, the answer was the same. The Lancaster family has made arrangements. We're not authorized to allow visitation. They'd even taken that from her, the right to see her own children's faces. She was packing her few belongings into a small bag when there was a knock at the door. Evelyn looked up, expecting another nurse with discharge papers or maybe hospital administration with a bill she couldn't pay. Instead, a tall man in an expensive suit walked in, carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it cost more than most people's cars. He had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and when he spoke, his voice was gentle in a way that made Evelyn immediately suspicious. Kindness was something she'd learned to distrust. Mrs. Lancaster, or should I say Ms. Hayes now, he began, and Evelyn flinched at the correction. She wasn't a Lancaster anymore. They'd made sure of that. My name is Theodore Morrison. I'm an attorney representing your late mother's estate. Evelyn stared at him, confused. My mother's been dead for 7 years, she said quietly. There was no estate. We didn't have money. Theodore's expression softened even more, and he set his briefcase on the bed, opening it with practiced efficiency. That's what you were led to believe. But your mother, Ms. Hayes, was an exceptionally intelligent woman who understood that sometimes the best way to protect someone is to hide the truth until they're ready to handle it. He pulled out a thick folder, placing it carefully in Evelyn's lap. Her hands trembled as she opened it, her eyes scanning documents that made no sense at first. Account statements, property deeds, stock certificates, business ownership papers, numbers with so many zeros she had to count them twice, then 3 times, then 4 times because her brain refused to process what she was seeing. What is this? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Theodore sat down in the chair beside her bed, his expression serious but not unkind. Your mother came from old money, Ms. Hayes. Very old money. The kind that builds empires and changes history. When she married your father, she chose love over fortune, and her family disowned her. They cut her off completely, or so everyone thought. He pointed to a document near the top of the pile. What no one knew, not even your father, was that your maternal grandmother never stopped loving your mother. She secretly funneled money into a trust, building an empire in your mother's name, waiting for the day when reconciliation might be possible. That day never came. Your grandmother passed away 5 years ago, and your mother passed 2 years after that. The entire fortune, $1 billion, plus controlling shares in Hayes Industries, one of the largest private equity firms in the country, was left to you. The only stipulation was that you couldn't access it until you turned 30 or experienced a life-altering hardship that required financial independence. He paused, his eyes meeting hers with something that looked like admiration. Your divorce qualifies as that hardship. Evelyn's hands shook so violently the papers rustled like leaves in a storm. $1 billion. She read it again. $1 billion. The number was so absurd, so impossibly large, that it felt like a joke. "This can't be real," she said, her voice cracking. "Things like this don't happen to people like me." Theodore reached into his briefcase again and pulled out another folder. This one thicker, darker, and somehow more ominous. "There's more," he said quietly. "Your mother knew what kind of family you'd married into. She had investigators looking into the Lancasters from the moment you announced your engagement. What they found." He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Let's just say the Lancaster fortune wasn't built on legitimate business practices." He opened the second folder, revealing page after page of evidence, financial records, email chains, recorded phone calls, photographs of documents that should have been destroyed years ago. Evelyn's eyes widened as she read, her shock giving way to something else entirely. Embezzlement, fraud, bribery, money laundering, tax evasion. The Lancasters had built their empire on a foundation of crime, and her mother had documented every single piece of it. "Why didn't she tell me?" Evelyn asked, tears streaming down her face. "Why didn't she warn me?" Theodore's expression was gentle. "Because she knew you were in love, and love makes us blind to red flags we'd otherwise see. She wanted you to make your own choices, live your own life. But she also wanted to make sure that if things went wrong, if they hurt you the way she suspected they might, you'd have the power to fight back." Evelyn looked down at the evidence in her hands, her mind racing. Every cruel word Margaret had ever spoken. Every cold dismissal from Garrett. Every mocking laugh from Vivian. Every condescending look from Richard. They'd treated her like she was worthless, powerless, disposable. They'd taken her children, stripped away her dignity, and thrown her away like garbage. And the whole time, they'd been criminals hiding behind designer clothes and charity galas. The irony was so bitter, it almost made her laugh. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice stronger than it had been in years. Theodore smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "Now, Ms. Hayes, you get to decide. You can walk away, take the money, and disappear. Build a new life, somewhere they'll never find you. Or," he paused, letting the word hang in the air like a challenge. "Or you can fight. You have the resources, the evidence, and the legal standing to destroy everything they built. You can take back your children, expose their crimes, and make them pay for every moment of suffering they've caused you. The choice is yours." Evelyn closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her chest. Walk away and be safe, or fight and risk everything for justice. For her children. For the woman she used to be and the woman she could become. When she opened her eyes, they were clear and focused in a way they hadn't been in 5 years. "I want to fight," she said, her voice steady as stone. "I want to take everything from them. Every dollar, every asset, every ounce of respect they think they've earned. I want them to know what it feels like to lose everything in a single moment." Theodore nodded, his smile widening. "Then, we have a lot of work to do. But first, you need to recover. Physically and mentally. The battle ahead won't be easy, and you'll need to be at full strength." Over the next 3 days, while still in the hospital recovering from childbirth, Evelyn met with a team of lawyers, financial advisors, and private investigators that Theodore had assembled. They worked in shifts, coming to her room with documents, strategies, and plans that became more complex with each passing hour. She learned about offshore accounts and shell companies, about forensic accounting and legal precedents, about custody battles and character witnesses. She learned that the Lancasters had enemies, lots of them. People they'd stepped on while climbing to the top. People who would be more than happy to testify against them when the time came. She learned that power wasn't just about money. It was about information, timing, and the willingness to use both without mercy. But she also learned about her children. Theodore had used his connections to get updates from the hospital staff before the babies were transferred to the Lancaster estate. "They're healthy," he told her gently. "Perfect, actually. 2 girls, Emma and Sophia, according to the birth certificates the Lancasters filed. And 1 boy, James. They're being well cared for physically." The names hit her like a punch to the gut. They'd named her children without her. They'd stolen even that from her. "I want them back," Evelyn said, her voice hard. "I don't care what it takes." I want my children back. Theodore's expression was serious. Then, you need to understand something, Ms. Hayes. The Lancasters have money, connections, and a legal team that's been protecting their interests for decades. If you go after them publicly right now, while you're still recovering and vulnerable, they'll crush you. We need to be strategic. We need to build an unshakable case for custody while simultaneously dismantling their empire from the inside out. It will take time, maybe months. Can you be patient for that long? Could she? Could she wait months while her babies grew and learn to recognize the faces of their grandparents, their aunt, their father, everyone except their mother? The thought was agony. But Evelyn had learned something in 5 years of suffering. She'd learned that sometimes survival requires patience. Sometimes strength means knowing when to retreat, regroup, and strike when your enemy least expects it. I can be patient, she said quietly. But I need to know they're safe. I need updates. Photos. Something. Theodore nodded. We can arrange that. Discreetly. The fewer people who know you're planning your return, the better. He stood, gathering his papers. Rest now, Ms. Hayes. Heal. And when you're ready, we'll begin the most important work of your life. That night, alone in her hospital room, with moonlight streaming through the window, Evelyn pulled out the folder of evidence against the Lancasters and read every page. Every falsified tax return. Every bribed official. Every stolen dollar. She memorized the details, letting them burn into her memory like brands. These were the weapons she'd used to destroy them. These were the tools of her revenge. And as she sat there, surrounded by proof of their crimes, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not hope, but something better. She felt power. Real power. The kind that couldn't be stripped away with cruel words or divorce papers or stolen wedding rings. The Lancasters thought they'd won. They thought they'd broken her beyond repair. They thought the girl they'd tormented for 5 years was gone, replaced by a hollow shell of a woman who'd slink away into obscurity and never be heard from again. They were wrong. That girl was dead. But in her place was someone far more dangerous. Someone with nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Someone with $1 billion, documented proof of their crimes, and a burning need for justice that would consume everything in its path. The Lancasters had made a critical mistake. They'd underestimated her. And that mistake would cost them everything. 3 months passed in silence, while the Lancasters celebrated their victory and paraded Evelyn's children through society events like trophies. Evelyn Hayes disappeared from the world they knew. She didn't vanish completely. That would have been suspicious. Instead, she became invisible in the way only the forgotten can be. She rented a modest apartment under her maiden name in a neighborhood where no one asked questions and no one cared about society gossip. The place was small, simple, and nothing like the mansion she'd been thrown out of, but it was hers. Every piece of furniture she bought with her own money, every decision she made without permission, every morning she woke up without someone telling her she was worthless. It all added up to something she hadn't felt in 5 years. Freedom. But freedom wasn't enough. Not when her children were growing up without her, learning to smile at faces that weren't hers, hearing voices that would teach them to see their mother as the woman who abandoned them. Theodore visited her apartment every week, always arriving after dark, always carrying folders that grew thicker with each visit. They're thriving, he'd tell her, showing her photographs his investigator had taken from a distance. Emma with Margaret's hand on her shoulder at a charity lunch. Sophia sleeping in an ornate crib that probably cost more than most cars. James being held by Garrett, who smiled for the cameras while holding the son he'd never wanted. Each photograph was a knife to Evelyn's heart, but she studied them anyway, memorizing every detail of the children she'd brought into the world but couldn't touch. How much longer? She'd ask every time, and Theodore's answer was always the same. Until we're certain. Until the case is so strong they can't fight it. Until you're so powerful they can't touch you. So Evelyn waited, but she didn't wait passively. She learned. Every morning, she woke at 5 and spent 3 hours studying business law, contract negotiations, and corporate finance. Theodore had assembled a team of the best tutors money could buy, and they educated her like she was preparing for war, because she was. She learned about hostile takeovers and shareholder voting rights, about SEC regulations and fiduciary responsibilities, about the 1,000 ways a company could be destroyed from the inside, if you knew where to strike. Her mind, which had been dulled by years of being told she was stupid, sharpened like a blade being ground against stone. By month 2, she was sitting in on board meetings for Hayes Industries via video conference, watching the executives her mother had trusted run the empire she'd inherited. They were good at what they did, but they were also comfortable. Maybe too comfortable. They didn't know that the silent woman on the screen was studying them, learning their strengths and weaknesses, figuring out who could be trusted and who would need to be replaced when the time came. "Ms. Hayes," the CFO said during one meeting, "we weren't expecting you to attend. Is there anything specific you'd like to discuss?" Evelyn had prepared for this moment. "I'm learning," she said simply. "I want to understand every aspect of this business. Continue as you were." They exchanged glances, probably wondering if she was a threat or just a wealthy heiress playing at being involved. They'd find out soon enough. She also hired a different kind of team, one that specialized in information that couldn't be found in legal documents. Private investigators who knew how to follow people without being seen, how to access records that were supposed to be sealed, how to find the secrets that powerful families paid millions to keep buried. What they discovered about the Lancasters went beyond the evidence her mother had collected. It was worse. Richard Lancaster had been bribing city officials for decades, securing contracts that should have gone to competitive bidding. Margaret had been embezzling from her own charity foundation, funneling money into offshore accounts, while claiming tax deductions for donations she'd never made. Vivian had been involved in insider trading, using information Garrett fed her from his position on corporate boards. And Garrett had been having affairs with at least 4 different women over the course of his marriage to Evelyn, including one with a woman named Celeste Montgomery, a socialite from a family almost as wealthy as the Lancasters. "This Celeste," Evelyn said to Theodore during one of their late-night meetings, pointing to a photograph of a beautiful woman with perfect hair and a smile that looked expensive. "She's the one he was seeing while I was pregnant." Theodore nodded grimly. "They've been together for 2 years. Our sources say he's planning to marry her once the divorce is finalized and enough time has passed to avoid scandal." Evelyn stared at the photograph, feeling nothing. Not jealousy, not pain, not even anger. Just a cold calculation. Get me everything for her. Everything. I want to know her weaknesses, her secrets, her vulnerabilities. If Garrett loves her, then she's leveraged. Theodore smiled. The kind of smile a chess player makes when they see the winning move 10 steps ahead. Already done. But the most important transformation wasn't in Evelyn's knowledge or her team or her growing understanding of how to destroy her enemies. It was in her. She looked different now. She'd gained back the weight she'd lost during pregnancy, but it distributed differently, settling into curves that made her look healthy and strong rather than frail and broken. She'd cut her hair shorter, styled it in a way that framed her face with confidence instead of hiding behind it. She'd started working out, not obsessively, but consistently, building strength in muscles that had atrophied during years of emotional exhaustion. When she looked in the mirror now, she didn't see the victim the Lancasters had created. She saw someone capable of anything. Have you ever watched someone rebuild themselves from nothing? That's what Evelyn did, piece by piece, day by day, until the woman who'd signed divorce papers while bleeding in a hospital bed was unrecognizable. She practiced her new voice in the mirror, not weak and apologetic, but clear and commanding. She practiced her posture, her walk, her handshake. She studied how powerful women moved through the world, how they took up space without apologizing for it, how they looked people in the eye and held their ground. She became fluent in the language of power, and it suited her better than submission ever had. One night, for months after her world had ended, Theodore arrived with news that changed everything. "We have it," he said, spreading documents across her coffee table. "Everything we need to file for full custody. The evidence of their crimes. Character witnesses who'll testify about the hostile environment. Medical records showing you've recovered completely. Financial statements proving you can provide everything the children need. Expert testimony about the importance of maternal bonding. It's airtight, Evelyn. We can file tomorrow if you're ready. Evelyn picked up the documents, her hand steady now, her heart pounding with something that felt like anticipation. Not yet, she said quietly. Theodore looked surprised. Why not? Every day that passes is another day you're separated from your children. Because custody isn't enough, Evelyn said, meeting his eyes. I don't just want my children back. I want the Lancasters destroyed. Completely. I want their fortune gone, their reputation ruined, their freedom threatened. I want them to understand what it feels like to lose everything in a single moment, while the people who destroyed them watch and do nothing. Filing for custody tips our hand. They'll know I'm coming, and they'll prepare. I need them blind and arrogant and completely unprepared for what's about to hit them. She stood up, pacing the small apartment like a caged animal that had just figured out the lock. We do this strategically. We launch everything at once, the custody suit, the criminal charges, the civil lawsuits, the media exposure. We hit them from every direction simultaneously so they can't fight back effectively. And we do it publicly, at a moment when they're most vulnerable and I'm most powerful. Theodore was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You've thought this through. Evelyn smiled, and it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who'd been broken and had put themselves back together with steel instead of hope. I've had nothing but time to think. So here's what we're going to do. The Lancaster Foundation is hosting their annual charity gala in 2 months. It's their biggest event of the year. All the major donors, all the press, all the society people they've spent decades impressing. I'm going to attend. Not as Evelyn Lancaster, the broken ex-wife they discarded. As Evelyn Hayes, billionaire CEO of Hayes Industries, and the woman who's about to burn their world to the ground. Theodore leaned back, a look of admiration crossing his face. You want to destroy them in front of everyone they've ever tried to impress. Evelyn nodded. I want them to see it coming. I want that split second where they realize what's happening, where they understand that the woman they thought they'd broken is the one holding the match. And then I want to watch everything they've built turn to ash. She picked up the photograph of her children that Theodore always brought with him, the most recent one, taken just 3 days ago. Emma and Sophia were bigger now, their faces fuller, their eyes brighter. James had Garrett's nose, but Evelyn's mouth, and the combination made her heart ache. How much longer until I can hold them? She whispered. 2 months, Theodore said gently. 2 months of preparation, 1 night of reckoning, and then you'll have your children back. I promise you that. Evelyn set the photograph down carefully, treating it like the precious thing it was. Then we have work to do. I need to prepare my statement. I need to coordinate with the prosecutors about criminal charges. I need to ensure every asset they own is frozen the moment we strike. I need to be perfect, Theodore. Not good. Not strong. Perfect. Because I'm only going to get 1 chance at this, and I can't afford to fail. Over the next 2 months, Evelyn transformed her apartment into a war room. The walls were covered with charts tracking Lancaster assets, timelines of their crimes, lists of witnesses and evidence. She memorized every detail until she could recite it in her sleep. She rehearsed her public statement until every word carried exactly the weight she intended. She met with prosecutors, with journalists, with former Lancaster employees who'd been silenced with non-disclosure agreements, but were willing to break them if it meant justice. She built an army of truth, and every soldier was ready to march when she gave the word. She also made herself impossible to ignore. She started attending charity events, not Lancaster events, but competing ones, where she donated enormous sums under the Hayes name and made sure photographers captured her looking confident, powerful, and absolutely nothing like the broken woman the Lancasters remembered. Whispers started spreading through society circles. Who is Evelyn Hayes? Where did she come from? Is she related to the Hayes Industries family? Let them wonder. Let them talk. Let the rumors build until the night when all the pieces would finally come together, and the Lancasters would realize they'd made the greatest mistake of their lives. The night before the Lancaster Foundation Gala, Evelyn stood in front of her mirror, wearing a dress that cost more than the Lancasters had given her in the entire 5 years of marriage. It was midnight blue, elegant without being flashy, powerful without trying too hard. Her hair was perfect. Her makeup was flawless. But more than that, her eyes were different. They were the eyes of someone who'd walked through fire and come out forged in steel. Theodore knocked on the door, and when she opened it, his expression said everything. "You look like someone who's about to change the world," he said. Evelyn smiled. "Good. Because that's exactly what I'm about to do." The night of the Lancaster Foundation Gala arrived like a storm that had been gathering for months. Evelyn stood in the back of a black car 3 blocks away from the venue, watching the parade of expensive vehicles drop off their passengers under the glittering lights. She could see them from here. The women in designer gowns, the men in custom tuxedos, all of them laughing and smiling and pretending their wealth made them better than everyone else. 6 months ago, she would have been terrified to walk into that room. Tonight, she was the most dangerous person who would cross that threshold. "Are you ready?" Theodore asked from the seat beside her. His own car was parked behind them, filled with lawyers and prosecutors who were waiting for her signal. Everything was synchronized down to the minute. The custody papers were filed and sealed, waiting to be served. The criminal charges were drafted and ready. The press releases were written. The evidence was compiled into folders that would be handed to journalists the moment Evelyn gave the word. All she had to do was walk through those doors and start the countdown to the Lancasters' destruction. "I've been ready for 6 months," she said quietly. "Let's end this." The car pulled up to the entrance, and when the valet opened her door, every head within 20 feet turned to look. Evelyn stepped out, and the whispers started immediately. She heard them ripple through the crowd like electricity. "Who is that? Is that Evelyn? That can't be her. She looks completely different. When did she get back?" The questions multiplied as she walked up the red carpet, her midnight blue gown catching the light in ways that made her look like she was glowing. She'd chosen this dress specifically because it was the opposite of everything Margaret had ever forced her to wear. It was bold without being flashy, elegant without being submissive, powerful without apologizing for it. And the way people stared told her it was working exactly as intended. Inside the ballroom, the Lancaster Foundation Gala was in full swing. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting everything in golden light. A string quartet played in the corner. Waiters circulated with champagne and appetizers that probably cost more per bite than most people spent on dinner. And there, holding court in the center of the room, like royalty, was the Lancaster family. Margaret stood tall and regal in a silver gown, her diamonds catching the light every time she moved. Richard was beside her, laughing at something a donor had said. Vivian was working the room with practice charm, her fake smile never wavering. And Garrett stood with his arm around a beautiful woman in red who could only be Celeste Montgomery, the mistress who was about to become much more than that if Evelyn didn't stop it. For a moment, Evelyn just watched them. They looked so confident, so secure in their power, so completely unaware that the ground beneath them was about to collapse. Margaret was mid-conversation when she glanced toward the entrance and froze. Her champagne glass stopped halfway to her lips, her eyes widening in recognition and something that might have been fear. She grabbed Richard's arm hard enough to spill his drink, and he turned, following her gaze. His face went pale. Vivian noticed next, her practice smile faltering as she saw Evelyn standing in the doorway. And then Garrett looked, and the color drained from his face so completely he looked like he'd seen a ghost. Maybe he had. The woman standing there bore almost no resemblance to the broken, crying mess he'd divorced 6 months ago. Evelyn started walking toward them, and the crowd parted like water. Every eye in the room was on her now, every conversation dying mid-sentence, as people turned to watch. Have you ever seen someone walk into a room and change everything just by existing? That's what Evelyn did. With every step, she reclaimed power that had been stolen from her. With every breath, she reminded herself that she wasn't the victim anymore. She was the reckoning. When she reached the Lancaster family, she stopped just close enough to make them uncomfortable, far enough to maintain her advantage. The silence stretched like a wire pulled too tight. "Hello, Margaret," Evelyn said, her voice clear and steady, loud enough for the people nearby to hear. "It's been a while." Margaret's face was a mask of controlled fury, but underneath it, Evelyn could see panic. "Evelyn, what are you doing here? You weren't invited." Evelyn smiled, and it wasn't a kind smile. "Actually, I was." The Lancaster Foundation sent invitations to all major donors. Hayes Industries made a very generous contribution this year. $2 million, in fact. "Surely you received the check." She watched the name register. Hayes Industries. The confusion spread across their faces like cracks in ice. They had no idea. They'd been so busy celebrating their victory that they'd never bothered to learn where she'd gone or what she'd become. "Hayes Industries?" Richard repeated, his voice sharp with suspicion. "What connection do you have to Hayes Industries?" Evelyn's smile widened. "I own it. Controlling shares, actually. I inherited it from my mother, along with several $1 billion in assets. Didn't I mention that? Oh, that's right, you never gave me the chance. You were too busy throwing me out of a hospital room while I was still bleeding from giving birth to my children." The words landed like bombs in the silent ballroom. People gasped. Phones came out. And the Lancasters. The Lancasters looked like they'd been slapped. Garrett stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and something that might have been fear. "You can't just show up here and make accusations. This is a private event." Evelyn met his eyes without flinching. "Actually, it's a public charity gala, which means I have every right to be here as a donor and concerned citizen. And I'm not making accusations, Garrett. I'm stating facts. Facts that I have documented evidence to support. Facts that prosecutors find very interesting. Facts that journalists are about to publish in tomorrow's papers." She pulled a small envelope from her clutch and held it up. "This, for instance, is a court order giving me emergency custody of Emma, Sophia, and James. It's being served to your family as we speak. By the time you get home tonight, my children will be in my care, where they should have been from the beginning." Margaret's composure cracked completely. "You can't do that. Those children are ours. We've raised them." Evelyn's voice went cold. "You stole them, and now I'm taking them back. Along with everything else you stole from me, my dignity, my confidence, my 5 years. Consider this payment." She turned to address the crowd, her voice carrying through the silent ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disruption. But I felt it was important for you to know that the Lancaster Foundation, which you've all generously supported, has been operating as a front for money laundering and tax fraud for the past 15 years. The Lancaster family fortune, which they've used to buy influence and respect in this community, was built on embezzlement, bribery, and criminal activity that I've documented in detail." The room erupted. Gasps. Shouts. The clicking of cameras. Margaret lunged forward like she was going to attack Evelyn physically, but Richard grabbed her arm. "You lying," Margaret started, but Evelyn cut her off. "The evidence has been turned over to federal prosecutors. They'll be issuing warrants tomorrow, along with the IRS, the SEC, and every other agency that handles white-collar crime. Your accounts are being frozen as we speak. Your assets are being seized. Your reputation, your fortune, your freedom, it's all gone. Just like you tried to take everything from me." Vivian's voice was shrill with panic. "This is insane. You can't prove any of this." Evelyn turned to her with a look of pure contempt. "Actually, I can. My mother spent 5 years documenting every crime your family committed. And I spent the last 6 months gathering even more evidence, including proof of your insider trading, Vivian. I hope you enjoyed your lifestyle while it lasted." Garrett's face had gone from pale to red, veins standing out on his neck. "This is revenge. This is just a bitter ex-wife trying to destroy us because I moved on." Evelyn laughed, and the sound echoed through the ballroom. "Moved on? Is that what you call abandoning your wife minutes after she gave birth? Is that what you call stealing her children and throwing her out with nothing? No, Garrett. This isn't revenge. This is justice. And the difference is that justice has evidence, law, and morality on its side. What do you have? Lies, crimes, and a mistress who's about to realize she hitched herself to a sinking ship. She glanced at Celeste, who looked like she wanted to disappear. Fair warning, Celeste. Everything he owns is about to be seized by the government. Hope you've got a prenup. Security was moving toward them now, probably called by someone in the Lancaster family, but Evelyn didn't care. She'd said what she needed to say. She'd done what she came to do. As the guards approached, Theodore appeared at her side with 2 police officers. Ms. Hayes has diplomatic immunity as a major donor and guest, Theodore said smoothly, handing papers to the guards. However, these officers have warrants for Richard Lancaster, Margaret Lancaster, Vivian Lancaster, and Garrett Lancaster. You're all under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, money laundering, and tax evasion. You have the right to remain silent. The room exploded into chaos. Cameras flashed. People shouted. The Lancasters were handcuffed one by one, their faces twisted with rage and humiliation as they were led through the crowd they'd spent decades impressing. Margaret was screaming something about lawyers. Richard was demanding to know who was behind this. Vivian was crying, her makeup running down her face. And Garrett was staring at Evelyn with an expression that was half shock, half something that might have been respected. You planned this, he said as the officer cuffed him. All of it. From the beginning. Evelyn met his eyes one last time. No. You planned this from the beginning. When you married me, knowing you'd throw me away the second I was useful. When your family tortured me for 5 years. When you handed me divorce papers while I was bleeding from bringing your children into the world. I just made sure your plan had consequences. As the police led the Lancasters away, Evelyn turned to face the ballroom, full of stunned socialites and donors. The evidence against the Lancaster family will be available to all of you tomorrow, she announced. I encourage you to review it before deciding whether to continue any association with them or their foundation. As for Hayes Industries, we'll be establishing a new charitable foundation dedicated to helping women escape abusive situations and supporting mothers who've been separated from their children. Because no one should have to suffer the way I did. And no one should have to fight this hard just to protect their own children. The applause started slowly, then built until the entire room was clapping. Some people were crying. Others were still in shock. But everyone understood what they'd just witnessed. They'd watched a woman who'd been destroyed rise from the ashes and burn down the empire that had tried to erase her. Evelyn walked out of the ballroom with her head high, Theodore at her side, and the sound of applause following her into the night. The car was waiting. The custody order was being executed. Her children were being brought to a safe location where she'd finally get to hold them again. 6 months of planning. 6 months of pain. 6 months of transformation. And in one night, it had all come together exactly as she'd envisioned. The Lancasters were finished. Their money was gone. Their reputation was destroyed. Their freedom was threatened. And Evelyn Hayes was just getting started. Because there's something the Lancasters never understood about the woman they tried to break. They thought cruelty would destroy her. Instead, it had forged her into something unstoppable. And now, the entire world would watch as she took back everything they'd stolen and built something better from the ruins they'd left behind. The car ride from the gala to the safe house felt like it lasted forever and no time at all. Evelyn sat in the back seat, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Theodore sat beside her, making phone calls to coordinate the custody transfer, his voice calm and professional, while her entire world spun on the axis of a single moment. She was about to see her children. After 6 months of photographs and reports and nights spent crying into her pillow, she was finally going to hold them. The thought was so overwhelming it hurt to breathe. They're at the location, Theodore said, ending his call. The social worker confirmed all 3 children are healthy, safe, and ready for transfer. The Lancasters' legal team tried to fight the emergency custody order, but the judge upheld it based on the evidence of criminal activity and potential flight risk. Your children are legally yours, Evelyn. No one can take them from you again. His words should have brought relief, but all Evelyn felt was fear. What if they didn't recognize her? What if they cried when she held them? What if 6 months was too long, and the damage was already done? What if they don't know me? She whispered, her voice cracking. Theodore's expression softened. Then you'll teach them. You'll show them every day that you're their mother and you love them. Children are resilient, Evelyn. They'll know. Trust that they'll know. The safe house was a quiet estate on the edge of the city, surrounded by tall hedges and security cameras that Theodore's team had installed. Evelyn's legs felt weak as she walked the path to the front door, every step bringing her closer to the moment she'd been dreaming about for half a year. The door opened and a kind-faced woman in her 50s stepped out, the social worker who'd been supervising the transfer. Ms. Hayes, she said warmly. They're inside. They've been fed, changed, and they're calm. Take your time. There's no rush. But there was a rush. Every second Evelyn had been separated from her children was a second stolen, and she couldn't wait one more moment. The living room was soft with late evening light filtering through sheer curtains. And there, in 3 portable cribs arranged in a semicircle, were her babies. Emma, Sophia, and James. 6 months old now, so much bigger than the tiny newborns she'd glimpsed for only seconds before they were taken away. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat, and tears blurred her vision as she approached slowly, afraid that if she moved too fast, they'd disappear like a dream. Emma was awake, her dark eyes tracking movement, her tiny hands reaching toward nothing. Sophia was sleeping, her chest rising and falling with the peaceful rhythm only babies have. And James was watching her with an expression so serious it made her heart break and heal at the same time. Hi, babies, Evelyn whispered, her voice shaking. Hi, my love. I'm your mama. I've been waiting so long to meet you. She reached into Emma's crib first, her hands trembling as she lifted her daughter for the first time since the hospital. Emma was warm and solid and real, and the moment Evelyn held her against her chest, something inside her that had been broken for 6 months finally clicked back into place. Emma made a small sound, not quite a cry, not quite a coo, and her tiny hand grabbed onto Evelyn's hair like she'd been waiting for this moment too. Oh my God, Evelyn sobbed, pressing her face against Emma's soft head. You're real. You're here. You're mine. The social worker smiled from the doorway. She's been asking for you all day. Babies know their mothers, Ms. Hayes, even when they've been apart. Evelyn sat down in the rocking chair with Emma in her arms, and Theodore carefully lifted Sophia from her crib, placing her in Evelyn's other arm. Sophia stirred. James was last, and when Evelyn held all 3 of them, one in each arm and one cradled against her chest, she felt complete in a way she'd never felt before. This was what she'd been fighting for. This was why she'd endured the pain, the humiliation, the 6 months of waiting. Not for revenge, though that had been sweet. Not for justice, though that had been necessary. For this. For them. For the family she'd always wanted and had finally reclaimed. The next morning, headlines exploded across every news outlet in the country. Lancaster empire crumbles. Billionaire family arrested on fraud charges. Evelyn Hayes exposes decades of criminal activity. From victim to victor. How one woman destroyed the family that destroyed her. The stories were everywhere: newspapers, websites, television news, social media. Photographs of the Lancasters being led away in handcuffs went viral within hours. Videos of Evelyn's speech at the gala were shared millions of times, with people calling her a hero, an inspiration, a symbol of what happens when you underestimate someone's strength. The public appetite for the story was insatiable, and every new piece of evidence that emerged made it bigger. Theodore arrived at Evelyn's new home, a beautiful house she'd purchased under the Hayes name, with a nursery that had been prepared for weeks, carrying 3 newspapers and a tablet loaded with news clips. You need to see this, he said, his expression somewhere between amazement and concern. Evelyn was feeding Emma, while Sophia played on a blanket nearby, and James slept in her arms. She'd barely slept, too afraid to close her eyes in case her children disappeared again. "What is it?" she asked, adjusting Emma's bottle. Theodore showed her the tablet, and Evelyn's eyes widened as she read. The Lancaster family's assets had been frozen completely. Every bank account, every property, every stock portfolio. The IRS had filed liens for unpaid taxes dating back 15 years. The SEC was investigating insider trading charges that could result in decades of prison time. The FBI had raided the Lancaster mansion and the foundation offices, seizing computers, documents, and evidence of additional crimes no one had even suspected yet. "It's bigger than we thought," Theodore said quietly. "The prosecutors are saying this could be one of the largest white-collar crime cases in decades." Richard's bribes weren't just to city officials. They went all the way to state senators. Margaret's embezzlement wasn't just from the foundation. She was stealing from elderly clients she managed as a financial advisor. Vivian's insider trading involved at least 20 different companies. And Garrett. He paused, his expression darkening. Garrett was involved in a scheme to manipulate stock prices that hurt thousands of small investors. People lost their retirement savings because of him. "This isn't just about your family anymore, Evelyn. This is about justice for everyone they've ever hurt." Evelyn looked down at her children, feeling the weight of what Theodore was saying. She'd wanted revenge, yes. She'd wanted them to pay for what they'd done to her. But she'd never imagined the scope of their crimes would be this vast, this devastating. How many lives had they destroyed while hiding behind charity galas and designer clothes? How many people had suffered while the Lancasters smiled for cameras and pretended to be pillars of the community? "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Theodore sat down across from her, his expression serious. "Now they face trial. The evidence is overwhelming, so their lawyers will probably push for plea deals, but the prosecutors aren't interested. They want convictions. They want prison time. And based on what we've found, they're going to get it." Over the next few weeks, the Lancasters' downfall accelerated like an avalanche gaining speed. Richard was denied bail after prosecutors argued he was a flight risk with access to offshore accounts. Margaret tried to claim ignorance of the crimes, but emails with her name on them proved she'd been orchestrating the embezzlement for years. Vivian attempted to flip on the others, offering testimony in exchange for a reduced sentence. But the evidence against her was so strong the prosecutors refused. And Garrett issued a public statement claiming he'd been manipulated by his family, that he'd known nothing about the illegal activities, that he was as much a victim as anyone else. The statement lasted exactly 4 hours before documents surfaced, showing he'd personally signed off on fraudulent transactions and had received millions in kickbacks. Celeste Montgomery, the mistress who'd been at Garrett's side during the gala, issued her own statement through her lawyer. Ms. Montgomery was unaware of Mr. Lancaster's criminal activities and has ended her relationship with him effective immediately. She extends her sympathy to all those affected by the Lancaster family's actions and wishes Ms. Hayes and her children the best. The statement was cold, calculated, and exactly what Evelyn had expected. Celeste hadn't loved Garrett. She'd loved his money and status. Now that both were gone, so was she. Have you ever watched someone lose everything, including the people they thought cared about them? That's what happened to Garrett. His mistress left. His friends disappeared. His social circle closed ranks and pretended they'd never known him. He was alone, facing decades in prison, with nothing left but the knowledge that the woman he'd betrayed had orchestrated his complete destruction. But while the Lancasters fell, Evelyn rose. Hayes Industries announced her as the active CEO, and the business world watched with fascination as the woman who destroyed one empire began building another. She was interviewed by major publications, invited to speak at conferences, and asked to sit on boards and committees. But she turned down most offers, focusing instead on the new charitable foundation she'd promised to create, the Emma, Sophia, and James Foundation, dedicated to helping mothers separated from their children and supporting survivors of domestic abuse. The first donation was $20 million from her personal fortune. Within weeks, other donors had contributed another $50 million. The foundation became a symbol of resilience, of fighting back, of refusing to be broken. Meanwhile, Evelyn's custody of her children was made permanent. The Lancasters' lawyers tried to fight it, arguing that the children had bonded with their grandparents, and that removing them would cause trauma. But the judge reviewed the evidence of the hostile environment, the criminal activity, and the documented emotional abuse Evelyn had suffered, and his ruling was swift and absolute. These children belong with their mother. The court finds that Ms. Hayes is a fit, loving, and capable parent, and that the Lancaster family presents a clear danger to the children's well-being. Full custody is granted to Ms. Hayes with 0 visitation rights for the Lancaster family members currently facing criminal charges. The gavel came down, and Evelyn felt the last chain binding her to her past finally break. That night, she sat in the nursery she'd decorated herself, soft colors, gentle lighting, everything the empty nursery at the Lancaster mansion should have been, and watched her children sleep. Emma clutched a small stuffed rabbit. Sophia's thumb was in her mouth. James slept with his arms stretched above his head like he was reaching for something only he could see. They were perfect. They were hers. And no one would ever take them from her again. Evelyn thought about the woman she'd been 6 months ago, broken, bleeding, signing away her life in a hospital room. She thought about the years before that, the slow erosion of her dignity, the daily cruelty, the constant reminder that she wasn't enough. And then she thought about the woman she'd become, strong, powerful, capable of toppling an empire and rebuilding her life from nothing. You did it, she whispered to herself, to the ghost of the woman she used to be, to every person who'd ever been told they were worthless and believed it. You survived. You fought back. You won. And somewhere across the city, in separate jail cells, the Lancasters were learning what it meant to lose everything. Their money was gone. Their freedom was gone. Their reputation was destroyed. Their future was prison. They thought they could break Evelyn Hayes and walk away without consequences. They thought cruelty had no price. They were learning, far too late, that some debts always come due. And the woman they'd underestimated had become the one to collect. The trial began 4 months after the gala, and the courthouse was surrounded by news vans, protesters, and people who'd come from across the country just to witness the Lancaster family's public destruction. The once powerful family that had commanded respect and fear in equal measure now sat in a courtroom wearing prison jumpsuits, their faces hollow and aged, their eyes carrying the weight of knowing they'd lost everything. Margaret Lancaster, who'd spent decades perfecting her image of elegance and control, looked like a shadow of herself. Her hair had gone completely gray without the expensive treatments she'd relied on. Her skin was pale and lined with stress. Her hands trembled slightly whenever she reached for water. Richard sat beside her, his shoulders slumped, his expression blank, like he'd already accepted his fate and was just waiting for it to be made official. Vivian cried constantly, her mascara running down her face in black streaks, her sobs echoing through the courtroom during breaks. And Garrett stared straight ahead with dead eyes, never once looking toward the gallery, where Evelyn sat watching with her children's nanny beside her. The prosecution's case was devastating. They presented evidence so overwhelming, so meticulously documented, that even the Lancasters' expensive legal team couldn't find holes to exploit. Financial records showed decades of embezzlement, with Margaret personally funneling over $40 million from the Lancaster Foundation into offshore accounts. Tax documents revealed Richard had been underreporting income for 15 years, avoiding nearly $60 million in taxes through fraudulent deductions and hidden assets. Email chains proved Vivian had engaged in insider trading on at least 30 separate occasions, making millions by buying and selling stocks based on confidential information Garrett provided from corporate board meetings. And Garrett's own signature appeared on documents authorizing stock manipulation schemes that had destroyed the retirement savings of thousands of small investors. The prosecution called witness after witness. Former employees who'd been silenced with non-disclosure agreements but were now free to speak. City officials who testified about bribes they'd received from Richard. Investors who'd lost everything because of Garrett's schemes. Elderly clients who'd trusted Margaret with their finances only to discover their accounts had been drained. Each testimony was a nail in the Lancasters' collective coffin, and by the end of the second week, even their own lawyers looked defeated. "How do you defend the indefensible?" one legal analyst said on the evening news. "The evidence isn't just strong, it's absolute. The Lancasters are going to prison, and the only question is, for how long?" But the most damaging testimony came from an unexpected source: Celeste Montgomery. Garrett's former mistress, who'd abandoned him the moment his money disappeared, took the stand wearing designer clothes and an expression of calculated regret. "Mr. Lancaster told me repeatedly that his wife was unstable and unfit," she testified, her voice clear and steady. "He said he was only staying married to her long enough to secure heirs, and that once the children were born, he'd divorce her and we'd be together. He made it clear that Ms. Hayes meant nothing to him. She was just a means to an end." The courtroom went silent. Evelyn, sitting in the gallery, felt Theodore's hand squeeze her shoulder gently. This was the confirmation of what she'd always suspected, but hearing it spoken aloud in a court of law still hurt like a fresh wound. "Did Mr. Lancaster ever express concern for his children's well-being?" the prosecutor asked. Celeste shook her head. "No. He talked about them like they were possessions, not people. He said they'd be raised by his mother, and that Ms. Hayes would be dealt with once she'd served her purpose. Those were his exact words, dealt with." Garrett's lawyer objected, but the judge overruled, and the testimony stood. When Celeste stepped down, she walked past Garrett without even glancing at him. The message was clear. She'd chosen self-preservation over loyalty, and Garrett was completely alone. The defense tried to argue that the Lancasters had been misled by financial advisors, that they hadn't understood the illegality of their actions, that they were victims of a complex system they couldn't navigate. But the prosecution destroyed every argument with evidence of deliberate planning, intentional fraud, and conscious decisions to break the law for personal gain. "These are not confused individuals," the lead prosecutor argued during closing statements. "These are sophisticated criminals who built an empire on lies, theft, and manipulation. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they did it without remorse for decades. The only thing they regret is getting caught." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous on all counts. Guilty, guilty, guilty. The word echoed through the courtroom like a drumbeat, and with each repetition, another piece of the Lancaster empire crumbled into dust. Margaret collapsed in her chair, sobbing openly for the first time in her life. Richard's face turned red, his hands clenched into fists. Vivian wailed so loudly the judge had to call for order. And Garrett just closed his eyes, his jaw working like he was trying to swallow words that would never matter anyway. Sentencing came 2 weeks later, and it was brutal. Richard Lancaster, 25 years in federal prison for bribery, tax evasion, and fraud. Margaret Lancaster, 30 years for embezzlement, money laundering, and operating a fraudulent charity. Vivian Lancaster, 15 years for insider trading and conspiracy. And Garrett Lancaster, 35 years for securities fraud, stock manipulation, and conspiracy to defraud investors. The sentences were consecutive, meaning early release was unlikely. The Lancasters would spend the rest of their productive lives, and possibly their entire lives, behind bars. This court finds that the defendants showed no remorse, no accountability, and no recognition of the harm they caused to countless victims, the judge said, his voice hard as granite. These sentences reflect the severity of their crimes and serve as a warning that wealth and privilege do not place anyone above the law. As the Lancasters were led away in chains, Margaret turned one last time to look at the gallery. Her eyes found Evelyn, and for a moment, something passed between them, recognition, maybe, or understanding that this was the end of everything they'd both known. "You destroyed us," Margaret mouthed, her face twisted with hatred. Evelyn met her gaze without flinching and mouthed back, "You destroyed yourselves." Then Margaret was gone, disappearing through the door that led to the prison transport, and Evelyn would never see her again. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Evelyn the moment she stepped through the doors. "Ms. Hayes, how do you feel about the verdict? Are you satisfied with the sentences? What's next for you and your children?" "Do you have any message for the Lancaster family?" Evelyn stopped at the microphones, her expression calm and composed, and spoke the words she'd been preparing for months. "I feel relieved. Relieved that justice was served. Relieved that my children will grow up knowing the truth about who their father's family really were. Relieved that other victims of the Lancasters' crimes will finally get some measure of closure. As for what's next, I'm going home to my children. I'm going to continue building Hayes Industries into a force for good. And I'm going to make sure the foundation we've created helps as many people as possible, so that no one else has to fight as hard as I did just to reclaim their own life." "Do you forgive them?" a reporter called out. The question hung in the air, and Evelyn took a moment to consider it. Did she forgive them? Could anyone forgive the kind of cruelty the Lancasters had inflicted? "Forgiveness isn't something they've earned," she said finally. "Forgiveness requires remorse, and they've shown none. What I have is peace. Peace knowing that I survived them. Peace knowing my children are safe. Peace knowing that the system worked, and they're facing the consequences of their actions. That's enough for me." She walked away from the microphones, Theodore at her side, and climbed into the car where her nanny waited with Emma, Sophia, and James. The babies were bigger now, almost a year old, starting to babble and reach for things and show the beginnings of their personalities. Emma was serious and observant. Sophia was giggly and affectionate. James was curious about everything, always trying to grab whatever was just out of reach. They were perfect, and they were hers, and that was all that mattered. But the Lancasters' fall wasn't finished yet. Their assets, which had been frozen during the trial, were now being liquidated to pay restitution to their victims. The mansion where Evelyn had suffered for 5 years was sold at auction, the proceeds divided among the people who'd lost money in Garrett's investment schemes. The Lancaster Foundation was dissolved, its remaining legitimate funds distributed to actual charities that would use them properly. The family name, which had once opened doors and commanded respect, became synonymous with fraud and corruption. Society circles that had once welcomed the Lancasters now pretended they'd never existed. Invitations dried up. Memberships were revoked. The social death was complete and absolute. Even more devastating was what happened to their relationships. Richard and Margaret, housed in separate federal prisons, filed for divorce within months of sentencing. The paperwork cited irreconcilable differences, but everyone knew the truth. They blamed each other for their downfall and couldn't stand the sight of each other anymore. Vivian wrote letters to both parents begging for visits, for support, for some acknowledgement that she was still their daughter. Neither responded. She was alone in her cell, abandoned by the family she'd helped destroy. And Garrett received divorce papers from Celeste exactly 30 days after his sentencing. She'd waited the minimum legal time and then cut all ties, taking his name off her emergency contacts, blocking his prison letters, and issuing a public statement saying she'd been deceived by a criminal and wanted to move forward with her life. The man who'd thrown away a loyal wife for a beautiful mistress ended up with neither. In prison, the Lancasters discovered that wealth and status meant nothing behind bars. The other inmates didn't care about designer clothes or charity galas or family names. They cared about respect earned through actions, and the Lancasters had none. Margaret was assigned to laundry duty, spending her days washing sheets and towels while her hands, which had once worn million-dollar rings, cracked and bled from industrial detergent. Richard worked in the prison kitchen, his expensive tastes mocked by the other inmates, who made him eat the same slop he served. Vivian was placed in a unit with women who'd committed real crimes of passion and survival, and they had no patience for a rich girl who'd stolen from people for fun. And Garrett was housed with financial criminals who viewed him as the worst kind of fraud, the kind who'd stolen from regular people trying to build futures for their families. Have you ever wondered what happens to powerful people when their power is stripped away? They don't handle it well. Within the first year, all 4 Lancasters were in therapy for depression and anxiety. Margaret had a breakdown that landed her in the prison psych ward for 3 months. Richard developed health problems that would plague him for the rest of his sentence. Vivian gained 60 pounds from stress eating and stopped caring about her appearance entirely. And Garrett aged 20 years and 1, his hair going gray, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow with the knowledge that he'd thrown away everything real for things that never mattered. Meanwhile, letters arrived at Evelyn's home. Letters from the Lancasters, smuggled out through prison mail, begging for mercy, for visits, for some connection to the world they'd lost. Margaret's letters were angry, blaming Evelyn for everything, refusing to take responsibility. Richard's were pathetic, asking for money for commissary, for help with appeals, for anything. Vivian was desperate, claiming she'd been manipulated by her family and didn't deserve her sentence. And Garrett's letters were different. They were apologies. Long, detailed admissions of guilt and expressions of regret that might have been genuine or might have been manipulation. Evelyn would never know, because she never opened them. She had Theodore collect every letter and file them away unread. They had their chance to be decent human beings, she told him. They chose cruelty instead. I don't owe them my attention now. The letters kept coming, and she kept ignoring them. And eventually, the Lancasters realized that the woman they destroyed had no interest in their redemption. They'd lost her forever. And with her, they'd lost any chance at the forgiveness they suddenly claimed to want. The Lancaster name faded from society like a bad dream people preferred to forget. Buildings that had borne their name were renamed. Scholarships were dissolved. Plaques were removed. Within 2 years, it was as if they'd never existed at all. And in their place rose the Hayes name, strong, respected, and built on a foundation of justice rather than fraud. Evelyn's empire grew. Her foundation helped thousands. And her children grew up in a home filled with love instead of cruelty. The Lancasters had tried to erase her, but in the end, she'd erase them. And the world was better for it. 2 years after the trial, Evelyn Hayes stood on the rooftop terrace of Hayes Industries headquarters, watching the sun set over the city skyline. The building beneath her feet represented everything she'd built from the ashes of her destroyed past, a thriving empire worth $3 billion, employing over 10,000 people, and making a real difference in industries that had once been dominated by corrupt families like the Lancasters. But more than the money or the power or the respect she'd earned, what mattered most was standing beside her, tugging on her skirt with tiny hands that still made her heart skip a beat every single time. "Mama, look." Emma pointed at a bird flying past, her dark eyes wide with wonder. At 2.5 years old, she was already showing signs of the intelligence and curiosity that would one day make her unstoppable. Sophia sat on the terrace floor, stacking blocks with intense concentration, her tongue sticking out the way it always did when she was focused on something important. And James was in Evelyn's arms, his head resting against her shoulder, fighting sleep but refusing to admit defeat because he didn't want to miss anything. They were perfect. They were healthy. They were loved. And they were hers in a way no one could ever take from her again. "You know what today is?" Evelyn asked, crouching down to Emma's level. Emma tilted her head, thinking hard. "Tuesday." Evelyn laughed, the sound genuine and free in a way it never was during her years with the Lancasters. "Yes, but it's also special. 2 years ago today, I got you back. 2 years ago, I held you for the first time since you were born, and my whole life changed." Emma wrapped her arms around Evelyn's neck, and Sophia abandoned her blocks to join the hug, and James stirred in Evelyn's arms, adding his tiny hands to the embrace. This was everything. This moment, this love, this family. It was worth every second of suffering, every tear, every night she'd spent planning her revenge and praying for this exact future. Theodore appeared in the terrace doorway, his expression warm as he watched the scene. Over the past 2 years, he'd become more than just Evelyn's attorney. He'd become her friend, her advisor, and the closest thing to family she had outside of her children. "The board meeting went well," he said, approaching slowly so as not to disturb the moment. "Hayes Industries just closed the deal with the Zimmerman Corporation. That's the 5th major acquisition this quarter. You're building something remarkable here, Evelyn." She stood, adjusting James against her hip, while Emma and Sophia returned to their playing. "We're building something remarkable." I couldn't have done any of this without you, Theodore. You saved my life. He shook his head. No. I gave you the tools. You saved yourself. There's a difference. He pulled a folder from his briefcase, and Evelyn recognized it immediately. The quarterly report on the Emma, Sophia, and James Foundation. You need to see the numbers. The foundation has helped over 15,000 women escape abusive situations in the past 2 years. We've reunited 342 mothers with children they'd been separated from. We've funded legal representation for 800 custody battles, and we've won 78% of them. The work you're doing is changing lives, Evelyn. Real lives. Women who were where you were are now free because you refused to stay broken. Evelyn took the folder, her eyes scanning the numbers that represented so much more than statistics. Every woman helped with someone who didn't have to suffer the way she had. Every child reunited with their mother was a victory against systems designed to keep families apart. Every legal battle won was proof that justice could exist if you fought hard enough for it. What about the scholarship program? She asked. Theodore smiled. Fully funded for the next 10 years. 200 students from underprivileged backgrounds are getting college educations because of your foundation. And the domestic violence shelters you funded? They're operating at capacity and saving lives every single day. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and Evelyn thought about how different this moment was from where she'd been 3 years ago. Back then, she'd been on a hospital bed signing divorce papers while bleeding from childbirth, believing her life was over. Now she was standing on top of the world she'd built, surrounded by her children, creating change that would outlast her lifetime. Have you ever witnessed someone rise so completely from such devastating lows? That's what Evelyn Hayes had done, and her story had inspired millions of people who saw themselves in her struggle. There's something else, Theodore said, his tone shifting. Garrett sent another letter. This one went through official channels, asking for a meeting. He says he wants to see the children. Evelyn's jaw tightened, the only visible sign of the rage that still lived somewhere deep inside her. No. Theodore nodded, expecting that answer. That's what I told his lawyer. But he's persistent. He's claiming he's found religion in prison, that he's changed, that he wants to make amends. His lawyer is threatening to file for visitation rights. Evelyn turned to face Theodore fully, her eyes hard as steel. Let him file. Let him waste what little money he has left on lawyers. The court already ruled 0 visitation rights. He lost that privilege when he handed me divorce papers 60 seconds after I gave birth to his children. He doesn't get to be their father now just because he's lonely in a cell. Agreed, Theodore said. I just wanted you to know. He's also been giving interviews from prison, trying to rehabilitate his image, saying he was manipulated by his family, that he regrets everything, that you were the only good thing in his life, and he was too stupid to see it. Evelyn laughed, but it was a harsh sound. He had 5 years to see it. 5 years to treat me like a human being. He chose cruelty instead, and now he gets to live with that choice for the next 33 years. I hope every interview he gives reminds him of exactly what he lost. She looked at her children, playing peacefully in the golden light of sunset. These babies will grow up knowing their father chose hate over love. They'll know their grandmother, grandfather, and aunt are criminals who hurt people for money. And they'll know that their mother fought an empire and won because she loved them more than anything in the world. That's the legacy that matters. Theodore squeezed her shoulder gently. You're a good mother, Evelyn. The best. Don't let anyone, not Garrett, not anyone, make you question that. She nodded, blinking back tears that were equal parts gratitude and residual pain. The wounds the Lancasters had inflicted had healed, but scars remained. They always would. The difference was that now she controlled the narrative. Now she decided what those scars meant, not weakness, but proof of survival. Not damage, but evidence of strength. Over the following months, Evelyn's influence continued to grow. She was invited to speak at the United Nations about women's rights and economic empowerment. She testified before Congress about reforming family court systems to protect mothers and children. She was featured on the cover of Forbes, Time, and Vanity Fair, with headlines that told her story in bold letters. The billionaire who destroyed her abusers. How Evelyn Hayes built an empire on justice. From victim to victory. The woman who refused to break. Every interview, every speech, every public appearance became a platform to help others who were still trapped in situations she'd escaped. But the most powerful moment came when the Emma, Sophia, and James Foundation opened its first residential facility, a safe house for women fleeing abuse, designed to be everything Evelyn had needed when she had nowhere to go. The building was beautiful, filled with light and color and hope. Each room was named after women who'd survived abuse and built new lives. The staff was trained not just in logistics, but in empathy, understanding that residents needed more than shelter. They needed dignity restored. On opening day, Evelyn stood at the podium with her children beside her, addressing a crowd of donors, politicians, and most importantly, the women who would be the first residents. 3 years ago, I was told I was worthless, Evelyn said, her voice strong and clear. I was told I was broken, useless, incapable of anything meaningful. I was stripped of my children, my home, my identity, and left with nothing but pain and rage. But pain and rage can be transformed into purpose, and purpose can change the world. She gestured to the building behind her. This facility exists because I refuse to let cruelty have the final word. It exists because every woman here deserves the chance I got, the chance to rebuild, to reclaim her power, and to show her children that survival is possible, that justice is possible, and that love is stronger than any abuse inflicted upon it. The applause was thunderous, but what moved Evelyn most was seeing the faces of the women in the crowd. Women who looked like she once had, carrying that same exhaustion and fear and flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out. After the ceremony, one woman approached her, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "I've been trying to leave my husband for 2 years, but I had nowhere to go with my kids. This place, it saved my life." Evelyn pulled her into a hug, holding her the way no one had held Evelyn when she'd needed it most. "You saved your own life by asking for help. This place is just a tool. You're the one with the courage." As the months became years, the triplets grew from toddlers into children with distinct personalities and endless energy. Emma became the protective older sister, always watching over Sophia and James, already showing leadership qualities that made Evelyn's heart swell with pride. Sophia was the creative one, always drawing pictures and making up stories and seeing beauty in everything. James was the adventurer, constantly exploring, asking questions, and pushing boundaries in ways that were simultaneously exhausting and wonderful. They attended a prestigious private school funded by the foundation, where they learned not just academics, but empathy, justice, and the importance of using privilege to help others. "Mama, what happened to the people who hurt you?" Emma asked one evening during dinner. She was 5 now, old enough to understand more than Evelyn wished she did. Evelyn set down her fork, choosing her words carefully. "They made very bad choices that hurt a lot of people, including me. And now they're paying the consequences for those choices. They're in prison, which means they can't hurt anyone anymore." Sophia looked worried. "Are they our family?" Evelyn's heart ached at the question. "They're related to you by blood, but family is more than blood. Family is people who love you, protect you, and help you grow into your best self. The people in prison didn't do that for me, so they don't get to be family to you." James, always the practical one, asked, "Can they get out?" Evelyn shook her head. "Not for a very, very long time. And by then, you'll be adults who can make your own choices about whether you want to know them. But right now, you're safe. I promise you that. No one will ever take you from me, and no one will ever hurt you the way they hurt me. That's a promise I'll keep until I take my last breath." The children seemed satisfied with that answer, returning to their dinner, while Evelyn sat there feeling the weight of motherhood, protection, and the fierce love that had driven every decision she'd made since they were born. 5 years after the trial, on the anniversary of the day the Lancasters were sentenced, Evelyn received a notification that Margaret Lancaster had died in prison. A heart attack, sudden and final. There was no funeral planned, no obituary in the major papers, no acknowledgement from the society circles she'd once dominated. She died alone, unmourned, forgotten. Evelyn felt nothing when she read the news. Not satisfied. Not grief. Just emptiness where anger used to live. Margaret had gotten exactly what she'd given to others. A life and death defined by cruelty and isolation. The universe, it seemed, had its own sense of justice. That evening, Evelyn took her children to the beach, letting them run in the sand and splash in the waves while the sun set in brilliant colors. She watched them laugh and play and exist in a world where they were loved unconditionally, and she realized something profound. The best revenge wasn't destroying the Lancasters. The best revenge was this: building a life so full of love, purpose, and joy that the Lancasters' cruelty became nothing more than a footnote in a much larger, much more beautiful story. They'd tried to write her ending, but Evelyn had taken the pen and written something better. She'd written a story of survival, transformation, and triumph that would inspire people long after she was gone. As the sun disappeared below the horizon and the children begged for just 5 more minutes in the water, Evelyn thought about the woman she used to be, the one who'd believed she deserved the cruelty, who'd accepted that pain was the price of love, who'd thought survival meant enduring quietly. That woman was gone, replaced by someone stronger, wiser, and infinitely more powerful. And as she called her children back to shore, wrapping them in towels and listening to their excited chatter about shells and waves and tomorrow's adventures, Evelyn Hayes knew, without question, that she'd done the impossible. She'd taken the worst moment of her life and turned it into the catalyst for the best life she could have imagined. The Lancasters had tried to break her. Instead, they'd forged her into something unbreakable. And that, in the end, was the greatest victory of all. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and drop a comment telling us the part of the story you enjoyed most.